Good evening, friends and fellow travellers. Welcome to the Neil Oliver Show on GB News TV, online and on radio. This week, I'll be discussing new hate crime laws coming into force next week. Could this be the end of free speech in Scotland? And after UK farmers protested in Westminster this week, I'll be speaking to one of them who says there's a lack of support for UK food production. Plus, plenty of discussion with my panellist, futurist, lawyer and presenter Andrew Eborn. But first, an update on the latest news. We hear a lot about the matching butt cheeks that are our political parties and how left and right are meaningless terms, that you couldn't get a cigarette paper between the mainstream political parties on account of them having merged into one anti-human blob, serving not us, but the big corporations and unelected NGOs that are their paymasters. Well, it turns out the butt in question, the big fat bottom that is the authorities, is growing bigger every moment, swelling to absorb even more. By now, East and West, once confidently used as shorthand for the differences between totalitarianism and freedom, appear to be two more big flabby cheeks of the same backside. While dear old Rudyard Kipling could say East is East and West is West and never the twain shall meet, what we are treated to now is the wet sound of two great butt cheeks slapping together. Say and think what you want about Russia. Lump that country together with others you've been raised and educated to regard as enemies of democracy, if you must. Declare, if you will, that in Russia there's no meaningful democracy, that political opponents are jailed, that state censorship of dissent is complete, that the mainstream media spouts state propaganda and nothing else. Say all that about Russia and the East. But when are we going to admit to ourselves that to believe the aspirations of the leaders of the West now are in any way different than those of their counterparts in the East is nothing more than a collective act of denial of the facts? Not for the first time, it's worth remembering the end of George Orwell's Animal Farm, when the animals look through the windows of the farmhouse as their masters, the pigs, sit down to a meeting with their neighbouring human farmers. Quote, "The creatures outside looked from pig to man and from man to pig and from pig to man again, but already it was impossible to say which was which." The pigs had ultimately envied the humans, envied how they helped themselves to whatever they wanted and got things done by treating the animals like animals, while portraying themselves as somehow different and superior and therefore entitled to rule over all the animals. And in the end, they dropped all pretence and became what they had once beheld, walking, dressing and talking like those they had once professed to oppose. I don't know about anyone else, but I've long since grown tired of the pretence here in our own animal farm of the West. I'm especially fed up listening to our pigs criticise those next door as though they were different. Here it's ridiculous to suggest we have meaningful democracy via the ballot box when all the choices are the same choice. As Henry Ford once said about the cars he was offering, you can have any colour you want, as long as it's black. Conservative, Labour, Liberal, SNP, take your pick. All the same, all committed to telling the rest of us what to do, while themselves getting fat on the proceeds of doing what their paymasters tell them. Their masters being the banks, the corporations, the NGOs and the intelligence agencies of the so-called West. Here in the UK, our government celebrates with a superhero Kerpow-style graphic, $1.5 billion to Ukraine. That's 1.5 billion sent to be laundered thousands of miles away before ending up in the already bloated accounts of the already obscenely wealthy. That might have been spent helping the people of the UK, more and more of whom know the truth of that war. I mention this obscenity because it illustrates at least one way in which we in the West are actually worse than any notional villains in the East, because we've evolved economies predicated on forever war. War everywhere and anywhere, as long as it keeps the cash registers ringing. Forever war, forever crises, populations kept always on edge. Are there any good guys anywhere? This week came the coverage of an atrocity in a theatre in Moscow. Over 130 shot dead by characters the US was instantly able to identify as members of Islamist extremist group ISIS-K, being an offshoot of the same ISIS that is claimed by many to be the creature and creation of the US anyway. conjured into being to depose the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Impressive, isn't it, that the US, whose successive administrations have failed correctly to identify even those who murdered their own president, John F. Kennedy, the US, where nowadays ships accidentally knock down bridges, can nonetheless, from thousands of miles away and with absolute certainty, identify those men and their affiliation, those thugs who slaughtered innocents by the score in Russia, while simultaneously assuring us that it was absolutely nothing at all to do with Ukraine. Many and varied, not to mention credible, are the contrary voices pointing the finger of blame for the horror at Ukraine, and those persuading Ukraine to deny the inevitability of its defeat in that money-laundering war. Intriguing, too, the way so-called ISIS terrorists consistently perpetrate atrocities against enemies of the US, like Iran and China, and now Russia. Funny that. And yet here we are in the West, expected to turn a blind eye to all the ways in which any meaningful difference between our day-to-day reality and the traditional authoritarianism of the East has been massaged away. We're invited to clutch our pearls when shown how Vladimir Putin and others silence journalists who ask questions, far less publish criticism, while Volodymyr Zelensky, great hero of Ukraine and defender of democracy, does exactly that. And you hardly need look as far as Ukraine, given that even as I speak, the US continues aggressively to seek the scalp of Australian journalist Julian Assange, presently rotting in His Majesty's prison Belmarsh for having had the temerity to publish truth inconvenient to the White House. We exist here in the bizarre, surreal universe in which Assange's legal team must seek assurances from the US that if he is finally handed over to them, that their man won't swiftly die there at American hands in the electric chair or by lethal injection, for example, or perhaps by suicide if his guards fall asleep while the security cameras are turned off. Julian Assange published the truth, and yet even after all these years of his incarceration, it has yet to be made clear whether or not a Western regime, ally of the UK and of Australia, will reserve the right to execute him for so doing. All across the West, larger and larger numbers of citizens rise in opposition to what they see happening around them at the behest of governments notionally elected to serve their interests. Farmers are in their tractors, not in their fields growing crops, but in the streets of one Western capital city after another, demanding the right to do what they have always done, which is to feed the millions and the billions. Most recently, English farmers have made Westminster the target of their own tractor protest. Not that you'd know it from the general coverage of the mainstream media, who, as in one country after another across the West, pay little in the way of meaningful attention to the needs of those who seek to feed us in the time-honoured fashion. Across Europe, the farmers' protests are defamed as the action of right-wing populist extremists. Authoritarians across the West, in the US and across Europe, have gone into overdrive in their concerted efforts to seize and maintain control of the narrative in this year that is scheduled to feature national elections in one country after another. Elections that have finally focused the attentions of the pesky people. Attention revealed in the form of growing support for alternative political parties that must, of course, be defamed as more right-wing populist extremism. Faced with populations grown increasingly wise to the deliberate erosion of freedom and of rights, populations waking up to the reality that their entire ways of life are targeted by regimes with aspirations that must inevitably be described as totalitarian and anti-human, panicky politicians draft laws that might simply be described as making it illegal to disagree with them. In Scotland, on April Fool's Day as it happens, the long-dreaded and heavily criticised hate crime laws come into force. In their infinite wisdom, the SNP-led administration in Holyrood has made it illegal to, and I quote the legislation, stir up hatred. Precisely what qualifies as stirring up hatred is effectively anyone's guess. The legislation employing forms of words so vague and imprecise, so subject to interpretation and indeed abuse by whomever is empowered or invited to do so, that stirring up hatred might mean whatever the relevant authority says it does. The Dean of the Faculty of Advocates, Roddy Dunlop, is among legal experts that have warned police might be swamped by completely malicious complaints by those with political and personal scores to settle against individuals they simply don't like. Critics have described it as a disaster in the making, right up there with the SNP's now legendary failed legislation that sought to slip a so-called named person I would say a snooping, snitching busybody into the lives of every Scottish child, a state-sponsored interloper empowered to enter into confidences with that child without the knowledge of the parents. The looming legal farce is fronted by Scotland's First Minister Humza Yousaf, a man who has loudly objected to white people with top jobs in a country where 96% of the population is white. And if that wasn't stirring up hatred of white people under the terms of his own act, then I don't know what is. And who has made plain his eagerness to see people criminalised even for things said in the privacy of their own homes, dare to mutter hurty words at the dinner table, and if those words are repeated by your child perhaps, within anyone's hearing, at school maybe, then the possibility of a knock at the door and challenge by uniformed officers is not out with the bounds of possibility in Scotland, land of William Wallace and supposedly immortal cries of freedom. April Fool's Day promises this new stupidity only for Scotland in the short term, but given the lockstep tendencies of the regimes of the West, the use of one small country as a petri dish for testing a given insanity in one place prior to replicating it in all the others, it's my hunch that it's hello hate crime law in Scotland today and hello everywhere else sometime soon. Always the intention is the same, to make speaking up, speaking out on any topic too risky, too much trouble for too many people. For too long, the would-be autocrats and tin-pot dictators living in the West could only dream of jack-booted totalitarianism. Now they have all but achieved the hitherto impossible and unthinkable dream of donning that gear at home for the purposes of stamping on human faces, as Orwell predicted, forever. Here's the thing. I, for one, am simply sick to death of talk of democracy where there is none, talk of freedom of speech and the First Amendment when the primary aim is to silence. Among much else, I want those petty dictators to come clean once and for all and just admit what they want, what they have all but achieved, which is the power to tell the rest of us what to do and what to think, while acknowledging there's not a damn thing we can do about it. Except, of course, there always is and always will be something we can do about it. And that's to get up in their faces and tell them precisely where to go and where, between the cheeks of that great big bottom, they can shove their nonsense. I'm joined this week by barrister, broadcaster and futurist Andrew Eborn. Andrew, do you not just get to the point where you just think, just tell us the reality, which is that you're fed up with us having freedom of speech and rights, and you'd rather just tell us what to do?
I think the reality, Neil, I mean, you're absolutely right, and we're right to be fearing the legislation which has happened. We spoke about it in various territories around the world who are introducing similar legislation. But it's always freedom of speech, but not freedom from consequences. And the difficulty, as you say, is in the definition. Because whilst everybody's entitled to express or should be entitled to express a view, and indeed there are provisions for that in the legislation, they're saying they're not trying to restrict it. The difficulty is when it does spell out into hate and encouraging people into that sort of side. But the trouble is the definition, and words are so important. They always say sticks and stones will help break my bones, but words will never hurt me. This is absolutely trying to deal with that sort of side.
Isn't the problem, as I have heard it expressed by legal minds, that it's the vagueness and the imprecision of what's in the legislation that's going to leave lawyers and the police kind of throwing their hands up, not knowing what to do?
Yeah, and statements have come out already about the police saying they're going to investigate every allegation. Now, if you're going to do that, it means that certain other crimes are not going to be investigated. And you're right, it opens the potential for abuse of that system, because people who've got a vendetta against a particular view or whatever, they could follow it up with this spurious claim. But there needs to be clear definition for the enforcement officers, for those who need to be properly protected and so on and so forth. And it needs to look at that mischief. I mean, the mischief is if it spills out genuinely into hate, that's wrong. But we must allow a system which encourages opposite views, so question everything and freedom of speech on that basis.
Indeed. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Elon Musk's secretive brain chip company Neuralink has begun implanting its devices into human skulls. Neuralink belongs to an upcoming category of medical devices called brain-computer interface that can help people who are paralysed or amputees regain some sense or movements. To discuss its merits and concerns, I'm joined by consultant neurologist Professor Mike Barnes. Welcome, Professor. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Neuralink is one of those words that, it's certainly lodged in my head, no pun intended, with all of the fascinating potential that it offers, but also a very strong sense of the unknown. So what is this latest news from and about Neuralink?
Well, I think it's potentially quite exciting. This technology has been around actually for a few years, so it's not brand new. It's been here for 6 or 8 years. Basically, it's implanting an array of very, very tiny electrodes in a relevant part of the brain. Part of the brain, for example, that controls movement or controls a hand movement. The signal is then transmitted to a computer that amplifies that signal, and it's passed to a computer that will move a cursor. But a cursor, for example, on a computer will move when you think about it moving, or your leg or your finger will twitch when you think about it moving. So potentially that's really exciting, particularly for people with spinal injuries, because the only problem with spinal injuries is a severance of the nerve between the brain and the end user, if you like, the hand or the arm or the leg. So it may be potentially really quite exciting for those people who may be able to walk again, albeit perhaps at first clumsily, or use a hand again, or think about using a computer or a telephone again. And so it's really very useful for those people. I think it's very early days. We've seen a man on the YouTube video that was controlling the computer for playing chess, which is very exciting and very, very good news. But it is a long way to go. I wouldn't want people to think this technology is going to be here tomorrow to help these people with any great certainty.
Now, I think we can all see the way in which being able to help a paralysed person, a quadriplegic person, for example, use arms and legs again would be wonderful beyond description. But there are also concerns, aren't there? And there's also, I suppose, ethical considerations about the extent to which it would be appropriate to have an interface between a biological human and machinery. It could be open to abuse in the wrong hands, couldn't it?
I think it could. I think it's like many things. It needs proper controls and proper scrutiny, if you like, to make sure it's being used for the right purpose in the right people. It's not abused. You're right. There is potentially worrying things about it. There's also always, so far, there's been worry, of course, about the potential abuse of animals in the research at Neuralink Laboratory. That was in the press a year or so ago. So there's many ethical hurdles to overcome here. If they can be overcome, and I hope they are, then I think it could be really quite life-changing for people with a whole variety of neurological conditions, particularly spinal injury.
Oh, definitely. But does it raise the spectre of an outside agency having access to what's going on in an individual's head? Is there a possibility of it's being misused, hacked? I'm not even sure what terminology to use.
No, I think at the moment the answer to that is no. All the device is doing at the moment is recording the signal in the brain. It's not allowing signals to be put into the brain as yet. It's recording what the brain's doing. The part of the brain thinks, I want to move that cursor to the left. The signal records that part of the brain. So at the moment, in its very, very early days, I don't think it is open to any significant abuse. But I think you're quite right to be a little bit concerned that in the future, perhaps as the technology improves, and it will improve over the next 4 or 5 years, we need proper controls to make sure that it's not abused by those who might want the wrong purpose behind it.
Now, futurologist Andrew Eborn, I can only imagine that this fills you with a considerable amount of excitement in terms of its potential, but is it a double-edged sword?
Oh, it's definitely a double-edged sword, and I've always professed a musketeer. I love the majority of what Elon does. And as has been pointed out, this has been around for a little while. We had a report last year, in August last year, of Anne, a 30-year-old who, when she was 30, had a stroke, and she'd been paralysed for 18 years. And they managed to do this, put an implant in her brain and managed to get signals that, using Avatar, created from her wedding video, she could do facial expressions questions and communicate in a way she hadn't been able to for several years. So really, really exciting on that point of view. But this is the worst it's going to be. It's only going to get better from now on. And so you're right to talk about the other possibilities, to talk about this is telepathy. You can find out what people are thinking on that sort of basis.
How does that sound to you, Mike? You know, the very idea of telepathy, you know, not now, obviously, but in the future, would it be possible that people would be able to share thoughts using a more developed iteration of this technology?
I actually think probably yes. I mean, we're a long way from that. I think people need to worry that technology is around the corner because it's a long, long way away, several decades, I would imagine. But yes, in theory, after all, we thought this technology was exciting 10 years ago. It couldn't be even thought of 10 years ago. So, yeah, things will move. And I think that's why we do need careful control to make sure this technology is properly controlled, properly regulated, and only put in the hands of those who really need it and would benefit from it.
But Andrew, it could be, couldn't it, seen as opening the door to transhumanism, which is that whole other world of exactly what does it mean if we can merge the biological human and the electronic machine.
You're absolutely right. We talked about Steve in the old days of the $6 million man, you might remember. Steve Austin it was. Nowadays, it's the $44 billion man with Elon Musk. Those sort of science fiction has become science fact. And I disagree, I think, about the time frame. I think it's going to happen a lot quicker.
Do you think so, Mike Barnes? Do you think actually the whole thing could accelerate quite quickly? Do you think maybe Neuralink are capable of more already than perhaps we know?
I think, well, it's possible. And of course, with Elon Musk's money behind it, that a lot can move quite quickly. And I honestly think that the brain is so complicated. And at the moment, what they've got is actually very simple in terms of just thinking to move a cursor from left to right is actually quite simple compared to all the nuances of human thought. So I do think we are quite a long way away from that becoming anything like reality, to be honest.
But we are, I think it was probably fair to say that we've opened a door into a potential future with lots of ethical and moral considerations and conversations that need to be had. Thank you, Professor Barnes, for that contribution so far this evening. Welcome back once more to the Neil Oliver Show. It's about to become a criminal offence to stir up hatred against certain groups in Scotland. But the laws are controversial, with some commentators saying all of it will serve to stifle free speech. I'm joined now by political commentator and former MSP Brian Monteith. Welcome, Brian.
Hi there. Great to be on the show again.
Good to see you. Now, you've said, I've read your recent remarks suggesting that the hate crime laws in Scotland could make Scotland a laughingstock. Would you elaborate on that thought?
Yes. What it is that there's an incentive within this system that has been brought in for people to actually make vexatious complaints, that is, complaints without any real substance, simply because, in a sense, they're hate-based themselves, to take down political opponents or to silence people such as J.K. Rowling, who they see as the enemy. There are perverse incentives involved because even if the police do not consider a crime has been committed, they can then record a non-hate crime incident. And that can then be, a number is given, it's put on file, and the supposed victim of what is not a crime is told all this. But it happens without the person who's accused of the crime but has not committed a crime then being told that they are a hate crime incident. It is absolutely absurd because then activists, very hatefully, ironically, can then go about complaining about everybody, trying to force the police to smother them and smother their free speech. So this is going to create more hate, more division in society, rather than actually try and calm people down. And just one other thing, freedom of speech means being able to take hearty words. And that's quite a different thing from inciting violence. Inciting violence should be a crime, but just saying hearty words about, I don't like these people because they have green faces or the wrong religion, that's quite a different thing from violence.
Andrew Eborn.
Yes.
For me, apart from anything else, it is the imprecision that's there in the language of the legislation. I would have thought that something that is the law, going to be the law of the land, would have to give lawyers and the police and everyone else absolute certainty. But the notion that someone just comes to the authorities and says that is hateful.
Yes.
Who makes that decision?
You're absolutely right. There needs to be certainty for all involved, including those enforcing the law. They need to have certainty as to what constitutes this hate speech. It's what I said beforehand is freedom of speech, but not freedom from consequences. What you need to do is you mustn't stifle freedom of speech. It's essential that we question everything. We encourage other people to express alternative views. What we don't want to do is have the hate speech, which turns into violence and so on and so forth. And I think that's what we need to look at. But when you're having woolly language, what I call woolly language, it makes it difficult for those enforcing it. As you say, you could get a whole catalogue of saying there have been numerous complaints about hate speech against an individual because people have points to score.
Brian, it's not just us, obviously, voicing reservations about all of this. The Dean of the Faculty of Advocates, people representing the police, during the course of this bill's progress through Holyrood, have raised concerns. Does it say something about that administration in Holyrood that they have just pushed and pushed and pushed ahead with something that all sorts of smarter brains were telling them not to do?
Well, this is actually political activism making law. The SNP and the Greens like to talk about consultation, but they actually turn an Nelsonian eye and a deaf ear to the consultation. The truth of it is, how this will be used and why it is so important to them is because once there are so many hate crimes being recorded as incidents, they don't have to be crimes, then they will say, we were right, because there's all these hate crime incidents. And look how the numbers are going up. And of course, as I say, the perverse incentives push these and push people to make more. And so from the back of the rise in supposed hate crime incidents, they'll need more draconian laws, more shutting down of free speech. And it's very interesting that this particular law does not protect women, but it protects all sorts of other groups, i.e. the groups who push the law, but at the expense of women's rights. And women are the targets here. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And because J.K. Rowling has been quite reasonable in what she's said, in my estimation, but obviously is a figurehead to many, they are seeking to try and take people like her down and gain more laws out of it.
Andrew, what it comes down to for me is, when did any government get it in its head that it should be telling the people who pay their wages what to say and even what to think? Humza Yousaf wants people criminalised for things they say in the privacy of their own home.
Yes, there's that famous T-shirt, isn't it? Think while it's still free to do so. And that's the reality. I mean, you have to have a system where you can basically have those whose views you disagree with, they must have a platform to express those views. That's the whole idea of freedom of speech. And what's going to happen on the 1st of April, appropriate date, as you pointed out, we're going to get precedents are going to come up. We're going to see what happens with J.K. Rowling and the statements, and see whether that's accused of being a hate speech under that new legislation. And this is going to happen. I think it's a very, very dangerous ground we're on at the moment because of the woolliness.
Dangerous ground, Brian Menteith. Just a last word from you. How do you see this developing? Are we just going to see a glut of mischievous cases swamping the courts that already struggle to cope with the workload?
I think there are many people in Scotland who will not be able to contain themselves or show any patience and are likely to submit continual complaints. They probably have them already lined. And it will place immense pressure on the police, who have said they will investigate every complaint. When they're not investigating, every burglary, every car theft. It just makes the law look an ass. It makes people think that it's not protecting them and not protecting their property. And it's all being done like student union politics. It's not living in the real world where people actually have to live and work and raise families.
Well, Brian Monteith, speaking for myself, as someone who's aired various opinions about various things in the public domain over the years, I await April Fool's Day with some interest. But Brian Monteith, thanks very much for joining us this evening. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Now, earlier in the week, more than 100 tractors rolled past the Houses of Parliament as farmers protested against what they say is a lack of support for UK food production. Save British Farming, one of the organisers, say cheap food imports and unsupportive policies are putting UK food security at risk. Liz Webster, the founder of Save British Farming, joins me now. Good evening, Liz. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, thanks for asking me on.
This is
with me.
This is a story, the farming protests in the world, all across Europe and elsewhere. I've been following it with great interest and great concern. And now here we are. It's actually happening here on the home turf in Britain. Can you tell us about the protest and what actually happened that you saw with your own eyes?
Well, we about 100 tractors drove into London. We started organising this a few weeks ago, and we've been working with some Kent farmers, but people came from Dorset and Berkshire and Lancashire and Leicester and all sorts of areas. And whilst, yes, there are protests in Europe, but the farmers across Europe always protest whenever there's change. The unusual thing is that British farmers are protesting, and that's really never really happened before. And it's really to do with the fact that we are facing a deluge of substandard imports. And these imports are able to be packaged with or labelled with a British flag if those foods are processed or packaged here. And that is giving us a huge amount of problems because it's undercutting us, we're tied to high standards, and it's putting us out of business. And we think that the British people need to know that, added to which the government are incentivising us to go into environmental schemes, and that means taking land out of production to grow flowers. And we are worried for the country's food security and food supply. And that's why we have started protesting or demonstrating, and we will continue to highlight these issues until we get change. And we feel that with the election coming, now is a good time for us to do this.
Liz, do you think that the increasingly, I suppose, urbanised population of Britain, and it's not by any means a British condition, do you think there's anything like the appreciation of how much we really do depend on farmers and farming? Do you think that basic connection in people's minds is somehow absent, that they just think the food will somehow magically be in the vast supermarkets?
Absolutely, there is a huge disconnect between food and people thinking that it suddenly arrives on the supermarket shelves by magic, and I think they think farming is a hobby rather than something that actually feeds them. And I think that there is a high expectation for farmers in communities as well, and people don't really understand that it's a really committed job. It's 7 days a week. I mean, we're carving at the moment, it means 24 hours a day you're on duty, and people just don't seem to appreciate what we do, why we do it, and what we mean for the country in particular. And also, if we give up farming in Britain to allow farmers across the world to feed us, we'll have a complete and utter loss of control. And us farmers find that really frightening. And that's why we're out there, because we want to feed the British people. We don't want to give up our farming. If we give up our farming, what will happen to the countryside?
Yeah.
So,
Andrew, to me, this beggars belief.
Yes.
You know, that we could be contemplating a situation where we don't actually grow our own food. I mean, I know it might be a little bit down the line, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but imagine if we're on the on-ramp to a situation where we are just dependent on all of our food coming from elsewhere, just because it's cheap.
I know you're absolutely right, and Liz makes a brilliant point in turning around, and we need to educate people as to what these certain things are, because effectively we're being peddled a lie, if you like, when you're saying you can use the British flag when, what is it, it's processed or packaged here, and you can still use the British flag. People will think, well, hang on, we must be homegrown. Well, it's not. And that's the reality. The more you can bring the awareness to people on that sort of basis, I think that's helpful.
Liz, I think there's something very powerful about the farming lobby, so to speak. You know, I think where the British population might turn a deaf ear or a blind eye to certain protests from certain quarters, I think it really resonates with people. When you talk about the farmers, you know, by inclination, a small C conservative group of people, and that when they're in their tractors, not in the fields planting crops or raising livestock, and they're trundling through central London to try and make their voices heard, do you get a sense that the people are behind you as they have been behind the farmers elsewhere?
We felt absolute love on Monday from the people in London, and all the farmers have really said that. They had people coming up to their tractors, waving. You know, it's Ramadan at the moment, and the people coming out of the mosque came through and jumped all over the tractors and were waving and throwing kisses. And, you know, we actually could cry with the support that we've had from the public, because we're isolated and we're really controlled by DEFRA, who are, you know, and we're put through this red tractor inspection as well, which is incredibly stressful. And to think that our products are ending up on the shelves next to products which don't have to go through any of that farm assurance scheme, and yet we have to go through these massive hoops. It's just so wrong. But then also the public are being misled into thinking they're buying British products when they're not. And so we do feel the British public are behind us, particularly those that feel, you know, connected to the country. And, you know, there's nothing more, I guess, secure, you know, it's about your national security, isn't it, food? Because we do know in the last war, we went down to 30% self-sufficiency when the empire fed us. But now we don't have an empire. And the thought that we could be held to ransom for food is really scary. But in addition to that, the new trade deals, and in particular the CPTPP deal, is a massive threat to British farming. And we really need to ditch these bad trade deals. They're really bad news for us. So we hope that moving forward as we go into the election, there will be more debate around the need to get out of these deals. Even George Eustice, the former DEFRA secretary, has been incredibly critical of these deals, which Liz Truss was at the centre of negotiating very badly. They are the worst deals in history as far as we're concerned as farmers, and we definitely want out of them.
Liz Webster, I can say unashamedly and unabashedly the farmers have my absolute 100% cast iron support, and I will hope you'll stay in touch, because obviously the plight of the British farmers is closest to my heart of all of the farmers around the world. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Good evening and welcome along to the second hour of the Neil Oliver Show, a chance to have a longer, more in-depth chat with guests, including George Samueli, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute. He's the co-host of the political commentary show The Gaggle. He'll be giving me his thoughts on the Russian elections, amongst other things. And I'll be joined by Stephen Shaw, the founder of birthgap.org, to discuss whether we are heading for a country of overloaded nursing homes and empty nurseries. All of that in the company of my panellist, lawyer, futurist and broadcaster, Andrew Eborn. Now, it's certainly being said that President Vladimir Putin has tightened his grip on the country that he has ruled since the turn of the century, winning Russia's election by an overwhelming majority in a result that was a foregone conclusion. Putin won just over 87% of the vote on a record turnout of more than 77%. That means Putin will rule until at least 2030 when he'll be 77. George Samueli is a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute, co-host of a political show, The Gaggle. And George joins me now. Thank you for joining us, George Samueli.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
This is fascinating. It's very difficult to gauge here in the UK, just how straightforward and honest a picture we're getting of the situation in Russia. What is your take on the way the elections were held, the way they unfolded? And, is it genuine popularity for Putin or something else?
Well, I really do think that there is genuine popularity of President Putin. I mean, obviously, the Russian political system is very different from the British political system, the American political system, or any other political system. However, I don't think anyone can question Putin's genuine popularity. And I think the reason for that is Russians have a terrible memory of the 1990s, of a complete disintegration of the country, terrible economic straits, babushkas being thrown out on the street, living off garbage, and they don't want to go back to that. And so they associate Putin with order, with a growing economy and social and political stability. And that's very important. And I think it's much more important to people than a multi-party system and competing political parties and all the electioneering that we're used to in the West.
We're told all the time that we're told here in the UK that there's no democracy in Russia. This is just offered up as a foregone conclusion. But as you describe there, what is the plight of democracy in the East into Russia, and is it held in the same high regard by the populations anyway, or are they happier with something else?
Well, the point about democracy is that it's a process. It's a way of governing. Now, in some countries it works very well. In other countries it doesn't work so well. I mean, we've seen various problems of democracy in the UK, in the US, and so on. But in other countries, what's most important is stability, is the ability for a society to function and to progress. And so therefore, when you look at Russia, Russians think that they aren't well governed, that they have a leader who has been very successful for them and who they associate with stability and security. After all, we also remember a time, let's say in France under General de Gaulle. He won election after election overwhelmingly. There was really almost no serious competition to him. We still said, well, France is a democracy. It's just that the French really are enthusiastic about de Gaulle, and they associate de Gaulle with a stable form of government, something that was much better than what they had before. And I think that something similar is taking place in Russia. We can't really use standards that we apply to ourselves or to the United States to a very different society, a very different political system that is Russia.
Andrew Ebon, I certainly remember the time, 1989 and onwards, when the fall of the Iron Curtain, when there was a moment where Russia might have been welcomed back into the fold of Europe. Yes. And I think Russia expected and anticipated that happening. And of course, they were just given a stiff arm. And now Russia is held up, especially by the US, but as just the universal bogeyman again. Yeah, it feels like a great tragedy at the heart of Europe.
No, you're absolutely right. And George made a very interesting point. We always assume, because we've seen the news coverage, that everybody who voted for Putin did so under duress. And they talk about sort of people standing armed at the polling stations and so on and so forth. And there is the possibility, people shouldn't dismiss, that they actually voted because they wanted Putin. And you look at that sort of basis, then you might then go into why do they want him, because the propaganda internally and so on and so forth. But it does raise those very, very important questions.
George, it's often said, and it's said by one of the Scotland's national bard, that it's important to see ourselves as others see us. And I'd be interested if you could give a sense of when Russia and when the more eastern part of Europe looks on at us, looks on at Western Europe, how are we regarded? How do we appear in Russian eyes?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think Russians are baffled. They are baffled by this extraordinary hostility that is on display in the UK and in much of Europe. They don't really understand where it's coming from. Because as you said yourself, 1989, 1990, the Iron Curtain falls, the Soviet Union gives up communism, the Soviet Union gives up the Warsaw Pact, it allows Eastern European countries to go their own way. And it was, the common state, that great, was first the Russian Empire, then the USSR, it disappeared. So the Russians thought, well, now you'll welcome us into your club. But instead, we had the NATO expansion, which was obviously a military alliance directed against Russia. It's a hostile military alliance. It went on relentlessly expanding, however much Russians complained about it. And the complaint started long before Putin came to power. I mean, Yeltsin was complaining about it, but Yeltsin was, of course, very weak and was unable to stop this. And the Russians saw that the reason why you're expanding is not because we are such a threat, but on the contrary, it's because we are so weak, we are unable to stop this. So the Russians look back and they see Britain, and it's day after day throughout the mainstream media, this constant talk about the evil Russians. Russia is a threat to us. Russia is interfering in our political system. Russia is trying to undermine this. Russia is trying to destroy that. And they are puzzled by this. There isn't anything comparable in the Russian media about the West. And so when they look at the West, then they say, well, why? Where is this coming from? And there isn't really an easy answer to this. I mean, what actually happened over the last 30 years, I think historians are going to be writing about this for many, many years. But it is definitely a mystery where this amazing, intense hatred for Russia came from.
I've never really got it. I'm of a generation, I suppose. I grew up knowing that the Red Army and the Soviets, won the Second World War, right? Freed Europe. I have that sense of what Russia did for Greater Europe, and I've been bemused by this recent bogeymanning of Russians, not just the Russian state, but Russian people. And with that in mind, what do Russian people, do you get a sense, think of this forever war in Ukraine? This that seems to be just rolling on relentlessly with an endless supply of money coming in from the US and others.
Well, I think that the Russian people are troubled by it. I think that they obviously are very supportive of the government, they're supportive of the war, but they are troubled by the fact that it's continuing and doesn't look as if it's going to come to any kind of a conclusion anytime soon, because NATO isn't prepared to come to any kind of an agreement. They are very happy just to keep the war going, to keep sending money, arms to Ukraine, provide tactical intelligence to Ukraine, provide information on Russian troop movements and helping them to target Russians. All this NATO is doing and is unlikely to stop doing. So I think Russians are troubled by, well, where is this going? Where we were expecting a military campaign that would be relatively swift, and it's continuing. And again, they're puzzled by why is NATO doing this? Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Ukraine is not a member of the EU. There was never any kind of a commitment made to Ukraine. This is obviously Russia's backyard, so to speak. It was accepted as Russia's backyard, as long as it was Barack Obama said, well, let's not mess around in Ukraine because this is Russia's backyard. This was always accepted by previous presidents, whether it was Nixon or Lyndon Johnson or Eisenhower, who said, let's not mess around there. Russians feel very strongly about this. It's their turf. Let them do what they want there. as long as they don't mess around with us here. And Russia isn't messing around here. It's not as if Russia's messing around in Mexico or Canada or anything else. So again, they're again a little baffled as to why the Americans and the Europeans is even more mysterious, why have they made the war in Ukraine an existential matter for them? How is this an existential matter for Europe? How is this an existential matter for the United States? Just thousands and thousands of miles away.
Andrew, I don't think we hear enough. I think it's very interesting to hear of that sense of bafflement and confusion from the Russian side, Russian people looking on at events and just thinking, what on earth is going on? I don't think we hear that often enough.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. It goes back to the central premise that we always talk about. You've got to question everything. You've got to get your news from as many different sources as possible, because somewhere between that lies the truth. And I think that's the problem. We don't get the view on the ground. I mean, what we're told is that a lot of the Russian people are against the war, is what we're told, and that Putin is a dictator and people don't really like him. They're being forced to vote for him. And I think you need to look at that alternative narrative and just sort of say, well, OK, maybe that's the truth.
Yeah, and George, while I have you, what's the Russian interpretation of what happened in the theatre in Moscow? Where are Russian fingers pointing when it comes to, making assessments about, who done it?
Well, I think the Russians are rather puzzled by this. I mean, there are also many aspects of these events that have still not been explained. They are baffled by, first of all, we have the warning that came from the Americans, and then they're baffled by, if the Americans had such accurate information about what was to happen, why didn't they provide more assistance? Why are the Americans doing victory laps? Because they provided some information. We don't know how useful or accurate it was, but the Americans are parading around giving victory laps. And most oddly, the Americans are absolutely insisting that ISIS and only ISIS was involved in this attack. Well, how can you make that determination when there's been no proper full investigation carried out, and when the Americans are not even involved in the investigation? So when Emmanuel Macron says, well, yeah, we know that it was just ISIS and no one else took part. Well, how does Macron know? He doesn't have any investigators on the ground. He doesn't know what's going on. The only people who know anything are the Russians' investigators on the ground. So they're puzzled about that. But there are aspects of this, without question, that are troubling for Russians. I mean, the apparent lack of security at this Crocus City Hall is very odd. The lack of proper fire safety precautions is very odd. What happened to the sprinkler system? How was it that the fire exits apparently were blocked? Why were they locked? And why were the most elementary precautions not taken? So I think Russians are obviously a little baffled by the Western response. Why are they so keen to present a certain story, like the alibi? No. There was absolutely no Ukrainian involvement, and particularly when there's obviously a lot in the media about a Ukraine Islamist connection, that Ukraine has been using Islamists to fight its war in the Donbass. I mean, that's been reported extensively in the media for years and years, ever since 2015. And yet,
George, I'm just going to have to.
Only ISIS. Yes.
I just have to jump in there, only because time is against me. I could listen to you talk about this and I could hear your perspective on this for the rest of the night, but sadly, I'm not able to do that. But I think what a valuable contribution is to hear that reflection on these stories where I feel we've got a very one-sided take on them here at home. George Samueli, thank you very much, and please be a guest again in the future. The US Food and Drug Administration has agreed to delete and never republish several social media posts suggesting that ivermectin, a drug that some doctors used to treat COVID-19, is for animals and not humans. The FDA tweeted, "You are not a horse, you are not a cow, serious y'all, stop it," and posted a similar message on Instagram. Mary Talley-Bowden was one of the doctors who filed the lawsuit, saying the agencies were interfering with their ability to practice medicine by overstepping their authority and violating the Administrative Procedure Act. Dr. Bowden joins me now. Dr. Bowden, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is a fascinating story for many reasons now, but you were a victim of all of it right at the beginning. Tell us what happened to you specifically.
Well, I'm trying to treat my patients for COVID, and every time I turn around, I keep hearing, well, ivermectin is not approved by the FDA for the treatment of COVID. And that's not the role of the FDA. The role is to approve medications for human use and then move on. They're not allowed to tell patients what they can take. They're not allowed to tell doctors how they can prescribe certain medications. So they really came between me and my patients, and it was happening on a regular basis. In fact, it's still happening. Even this morning, I was arguing with a pharmacist.
Prior to the COVID era, what was, as you understood it, what is the nature of the relationship between you and your patients in relation to the FDA? At what way and in any way were they supposed to be involved in that relationship?
I mean, in zero capacity. I mean, I never gave the FDA a second thought prior to the pandemic. And you look at the pandemic, the government just took over our healthcare. Doctors that were at home on Zoom calls and not treating patients were telling us how we could treat patients and even who we could treat. Never seen anything like it in 25 years of practicing medicine.
And what exactly was it that happened to you? You know, you were obviously finding that you were bumping heads with the authorities in some form. So then what happened?
So I just started speaking out on social media. I said, at the time, I really didn't have many followers. And, I'm a solo physician in a suburb of Houston. I'm not, chief of surgery at a major hospital. Didn't think my tweets would get very much notice, but they did. And subsequently, I had a hospital come after me in a very public fashion. They told the world that I was spreading dangerous misinformation, harmful to the community. And the media loved it, and the story went global. Then they turned me into the medical board. And so it just caused me to stand up and fight back. And part of fighting back was fighting the FDA overreach.
And what exactly is it that the FDA have decided to do? Because I know it didn't actually go the full length of going to court. What is it that they have agreed they will comply with?
They have to take down their most famous tweet that they've ever pushed out, the horse tweet. It got 24 million views in 1 week. So they have to take that down. They have to take down all their social media posts that are along the same lines as that tweet. They also have to take down the misinformation on their website where it's telling patients, it basically said you should not take ivermectin for COVID, which again, they're not allowed to say that. So it's humiliating for them, which is nice, but there's no monetary damages. But we're trying to set a precedent and keep this from happening again.
Bear with me while I read out the statement by the FDA, just to keep everyone square and up to date. The FDA has said that it has chosen to resolve this lawsuit rather than continuing to litigate over statements that are between 2 and nearly 4 years old. The agency added that it has not admitted any violation of law or any wrongdoing, disagrees with the plaintiff's allegation that the agency exceeded its authority in issuing the statements challenged in the lawsuit, and stands by its authority to communicate with the public regarding the products it regulates. The FDA has not changed its position that currently available clinical trial data do not demonstrate that ivermectin is effective against COVID-19. The agency has not authorised or approved ivermectin for use in preventing or treating COVID-19. And also bear with me, Doctor, while I bring in my studio guest, Andrew. How do you react to that? You're a barrister.
Yes.
You can consider this from a legal perspective, and as just a patient of doctors.
Yes.
How do you feel about the authorities interfering in this way?
Well, it's an incredibly difficult time for doctors, obviously. They were following government guidance and so on and so forth, and the whole spread of contrary information is very worrying. I mean, the FDA would say that their job is to check the data and make sure that things are safe and look on that sort of side. But it does make it very, very difficult. And I think, as you said, and they read out in their statement, they're not admitting any liability at all. They don't say they overstepped their mark. And they stand by their views that they think it's unsafe.
But it's a drug with a proven safety record. It's been successfully administered billions of times. It's in the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, and it won the Nobel Prize for medicine.
Yeah.
For the people who developed it, and yet the FDA, given all of that, were just automatically saying that it was for deworming horses and a threat to human life.
Yes, and as again, they sort of turn around, they say it's not an admission of guilt. And it's very difficult because if you approach it from a consumer's point of view, as a patient, as you say, we're patients on that sort of basis, you hear the very eloquent doctors who are following advice. They're put in impossible situations in what was a horrendous time and trying to find those solutions. And you're getting conflicting advice.
Doctor, while I still have you, in the general run of things, is it normal practice for a GP one-on-one with a patient to consider other medicines that are just available in the toolkit, I suppose, of the profession, and in that one-on-one conversation to decide a course of action?
Absolutely. I mean, the numbers vary, but a good estimate is 40% of the medications that we prescribe are considered off-label. FDA has not officially approved that medication for a certain use. And as for the other doctors who didn't do what I did, I'm sorry, but most of them just shut their doors, sent people to the emergency room, threw their hands up, said, not my problem. And all it took was, I didn't use ivermectin prior to the pandemic, but I did my research. And shame on those doctors for not stepping up and, doing their jobs.
Were you surprised by that behaviour? Because I can say for myself that I had previously just had an automatic sense of trust that my GP would listen to me and that he or she and I together would work out what I wanted to do in a given set of circumstances. For me, that relationship is profoundly altered now by what happened over the past few years. What do you make? Would you have predicted that your colleagues in the profession would have been so compliant with authority?
It's, hindsight is 20/20. I'm shocked at it. But, doctors are a certain breed. We make straight A's to get into school. We're not troublemakers. We're trained early on to stay in the lane, not buck authority. So that's part of it, is just the personality, the training. But lives were at stake. So that's what's very disappointing, is that people died because of their cowardice.
How are you affected at the moment? I mean, I'm guessing from your appearance here on the screen in front of me that you are still practicing medicine.
Yes, I'm still practicing and still fighting to get my patients ivermectin. I have to use special pharmacies. Now, I will say COVID is not the threat that it once was. It's more like a bad cold. I don't worry about my patients like I used to. But I'm still practicing. I have the medical board still coming after me. That's been 2.5 years of fight, and I'm basically just fighting until they drop all the charges. But yeah, we're still at it.
Andrew, it feels to me as if something quite profound has happened, amongst many other profound changes.
Yes.
That relationship of trust, founded on trust, that we have with the medical profession, with pharmaceutical companies, it seems to me fundamentally altered.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I always say trust comes in on foot and leaves on horseback, and never more so in these sort of really diseased information times. And it does make it very difficult. Going back to the point about being a patient, you turn around, you're reliant on your doctors, and then you have these certain people in authority telling you something different. It makes it very, very difficult.
Mary, what will the future hold for you? How are you regarded now? Do you feel isolated in your profession, is what I'm getting at?
Well, yes and no. I have networked now with a whole new group of like-minded doctors, and that network is strong and growing. And I think more doctors are understanding and starting to come around. But I think there is a deep divide. I sort of predict that there might be just two systems now of healthcare. And I certainly see so many patients that have lost trust in the system and are looking for alternatives.
It seems it's quite difficult to discern exactly what it means, I think, that the FDA have agreed to take down these posts, not just the one about the horses and cows, but they've agreed to take down several bits of information. And yet they're not accepting any kind of wrongdoing. You know, why then, in that, if they think that they were right, why are they agreeing to take down the posts?
I think they knew they were going to lose. I mean, first, our case was dismissed on the premise of sovereign immunity, meaning that if the agency is doing what they were allowed to do from the first place, you can't sue them. But so our case was dismissed, saying, well, they were just doing their jobs. We appealed. That we won on appeal, but that meant we could just keep fighting. So sovereign immunity doesn't apply. Then they challenged us on standing, and we barely made it through. We had 3 plaintiffs, and I was the only plaintiff they determined had standing. But once we made it through that, I think they knew game over, and they were going to lose. So that, and then, the goal of our lawsuit was just to take down that information and set a precedent, and that's why we accepted the terms of their settlement offer.
And I keep having to remind myself, I'm sure you do too, how long this has been going on. I look back and I have to remind myself that this is 4 years we're into this situation. And for someone like you, it's still affecting every moment of the day.
Yes, it's a battle. I think this is a war without bullets, and wars take time to resolve. But I look at this case as a turning point. There are 2 other really important cases coming up in the U.S. that could also really change the narrative and the direction of our war. We have Brooke Jackson, who is accusing Pfizer of fraud. She's a whistleblower. And then we have the Supreme Court decision. We're waiting on that, free speech on social media. So those 2 cases hopefully will just continue our win.
I will hope in future to come back and catch up with how this story progresses. But Dr. Mary Talley-Bowden, thank you so much for joining me this evening. I'm joined now by Stephen J. Shaw, founder of birthgap.org, to talk about something that absolutely keeps me awake at night. It's about the fact that we have a birth gap deficit. Now, that might sound slightly difficult to comprehend, but we could be facing a time of overloaded nursing homes and empty nurseries. Welcome, Stephen. This really preoccupies my attention, but before we get into the discussion, there's a report in Lancet, I believe. What are the basics of the reality that we face when it comes to the amount of people having babies?
It's hard to, perhaps see around this, but in the UK today, this year, around 900,000 people will celebrate their 50th birthday, but only around 700,000 babies will be born. That's a 23% deficit. Now, that may not sound a lot, but what that means is over a 60-year window, the number of births in the UK will halve, and then half again, and half again. We talk a lot about overpopulation in certain parts of the UK and those perhaps short-term issues. But this has been a long-term trend that's been going on for 50 years, and it's about to catch us up.
Are we really, in that 50 or maybe 100-year period, looking at the extinctions of indigenous populations here and elsewhere in Europe.
This is how civilizations end, and it's mathematical. You know, we go back to the Romans, and we find lots of evidence that the Romans were stressed about birth rates. We know this because they put taxes on those with no children and one child, but there's no evidence it worked at all. And, you know, the Roman Empire didn't phase out overnight. It was over several hundred years. We are going through that same phase right now. And again, it's hard to see in the moment unless you stand back to realize what's happening. And of course, it's not just the UK. Almost every developed nation and many non-developed nations or less developed nations are going through the exact same trend. So it's really global.
Andrew, we often talk, one way or another, we apply the word existential to challenges. But this absolutely is an existential threat that we seem to be sleepwalking into.
Oh, absolutely. And what's going to happen with these seismic advances in medicine? People are going to live longer and longer, and that gap's going to get bigger and bigger as a result. But the economics of the whole thing mean that somebody's got to pay. The younger generation always pay for the old one. And if we don't have that younger generation, we're going to have serious economic problems later on.
Yeah. Oh, it's devastating, both socially and economically. We're entering a new era where, you know, the NHS as we know it today, frankly, will be unsustainable. And I think we need to start talking about this more now because it's going to affect young and old alike.
Why are fewer couples having babies? I mean, what is basically going wrong in the fundamental ethos of go forth and multiply?
Well, that's a key point. It's actually not mothers having fewer children. People think it's because people are having smaller families. The average mother in the UK in 1970 was having 2.3 children. It's exactly the same today. And over those 50 plus years, it's barely gone up or down at all. And that's exactly what we find in all these countries. What has happened is an explosion in childlessness. And we know only 7-8% of women, some men too, don't want children. And we got to respect that. But childlessness in the UK is now heading towards 30-35%. So we're talking of this huge gap between those people who one day plan to become parents and those who actually do. And why that is, it comes down to, again, the data tells us this shift has been linked to delayed parenthood. People putting off the idea or not even thinking about the idea because they just don't know that in the UK, and again, all of these countries, only half of women turning 30 without a child ever become mothers. And it's not just the biology, it's having the partner. So delaying parenthood is the root cause here.
It is one of those examples, is it not, where the reality of our biology doesn't care about lifestyles and cultural changes and technology and all of the rest of it. That over the age of 30, even now, that, you know, as you're just describing there in blunt terms, the possibility of childlessness is as real as it ever was.
Yes. So biology is a major factor, but the biggest single factor beyond that even is not having a partner at the right time. You know, people get to a certain point in the career ladder, maybe 32, 33, it's the right time. And either there is no partner, or there's a breakup or a divorce, or your partner's not on the same page at the same time. And then late 30s, it gets harder again, and people then start to get a little bit tired. Maybe your friends' kids are already, you know, in high school by that point. So, you know, the odds quickly run away from people after 30.
Andrew, we also hear, don't we, about immigration will plug the gap. And that's also a reason given for why people should be more open to and tolerant of immigration, because, frankly, someone's got to take up the slack.
Yes, it's exactly that. It's a numbers game, isn't it? We need certain numbers doing certain jobs to make the whole economy work. But it's an interesting thing, going back to your point about statistics, is that are there people who want to have children who can't have children now because of whatever it is, and technology and medicine's advancing to assist that? Or those who just don't want to have children, either because they can't afford it or they don't want children? And then that's a difficulty, isn't it, about how we can force people effectively to start breeding.
You know, I started this project, creating the documentary, really as quite a pessimist, thinking that maybe it is the case that most people just don't want children. But the reality is most people actually do. Right. We're just not very good at educating younger people. We tell them about education, study hard, work hard, get established. We don't really share much about how quickly the fertility window does close on couples. And in terms of immigration, you know, this problem is global. The Lancet report you mentioned is saying that 97% of countries will be in this position by the end of the century. So the number of immigrants available is going to shrink. And, there are all sorts of questions about whether those immigrants will want to come to the UK. There's going to be so much growth in other parts of the world. So just saying it's fine, there's immigration, is a very short-term strategy. I think it's something we need to be focused on ourselves, not some future generation.
It's terrifying.
Yes.
What you're describing is this slow-motion extinction.
Yes.
And people maybe think, oh, well, he's talking about 100 years or 50 years in the future. That's not really my problem. But it is all of our problem. Everything that our civilization, our presence on the planet is imperiled.
Yes. And then, 60 years may sound a long time for births to half, but that means by the time someone becomes a grandparent, half the schools, half the kindergartens will have closed. That means an entire community will have been decimated. And this is going to be everywhere. So, people today, especially young people, are going to see this real time in their own lifetime for sure.
But it really is that knock-on effect, isn't it? It's the knock-on effect socially but economically as well, because as people get older, and they are going to be living longer. I was in Cannes very recently talking to the Japanese government. They got me down there to present for them, and they were talking, they're going to have, in Osaka, they're going to have an expo talking about longevity of people. Now they're going to make people live longer and longer and longer. And the difficulty is going to get worse and worse, isn't it? Because if you don't have that stream of people going into the system to basically finance the older people, you're going to have major problems.
Yes, and Japan's confronting that right now. I live in Tokyo, and you can just see it as soon as you go out of central Tokyo, the number of old people who frankly look as though they're living mostly lonely lives, and this lack of children. Right. So
I saw it with my own eyes, a version of something strange, really, in China, where on the street you would see a young couple pushing a buggy it was always a little boy, and behind them would be coming the grandparents. So that you had all these adults all focusing their attention for the future on this one little prince.
Yeah.
Right.
Because of the one child policy it's still having its reverberations down through the system.
And if you can imagine in that scenario, that child has no siblings, nor aunts, nor uncles, nor cousins. So really that child is not only...
And no bride, because the
balance
boy,
of
the little
exactly,
boy
you've got the whole thing skewed on that sort of basis.
Is there, as well as, you're talking about people delaying having children, and that isn't just a European thing, that it's a general Homo sapiens approach to life, but is there also an infertility involved? We used to talk all the time about, too much estrogen in the water, and it was affecting, male fertility and so on and so on. Are we less fertile as a species than once we were?
And I'm not an expert in this area, but one thing is for sure, as we delay parenthood into our 30s, it's inevitable that fertility will affect more and more people. And we can see that happening. We can see the large growth in IVF treatments or attempted IVF treatments. This worries me, but I have to say, infertility is not the cause of this problem, because this problem started, low fertility started in the early 70s. And I don't think at that time people were talking about, male challenges as we are today. That may be another effect that worsens things going forwards. But, having children in our 30s has multiple risks, and that's one.
Yeah. Are there, if as it were, there's a league table of challenged populations, who's doing worst? Who will check out of the human race first?
Yeah, South Korea. I mean, it's...
Really?
Yes. I mean, it's dire.
What is the birth rate there?
Last year, it was 0.7. 1/3 of the required babies are being born now. And this year, again, it's already treading down. I mean, it means that births in South Korea are halving every 20 years. So the UK is 60. By the time someone comes out of high school, they're already going to be looking at halving the number of kindergartens for that child. By the time they're 40, half again. By the time they're 60, half again.
So where's the healthiest one then? Where's the healthiest birth rate?
Well, if you look at some countries in Africa, their birth rates are higher, but people would say, that might be a concern for growing populations. The reality is that mothers in sub-Saharan Africa are having one fewer child every 15 years. So Africa's on the same path, but delayed. The healthiest rate might be France right now. They're 1.8. It's still not good.
Because you need to be well over 2 to replace.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. That's right. And there really is nowhere. If you want to find some country that either stabilised at 2, that really doesn't exist, or if you want to find a country that went down to the UK's birth rate, which is now 1.5, by the way, it's the lowest ever, 1.49 right now. There's no example of any country in history that we know of that has ever come out of this.
Sure, but the solution then has to be looking at why people are not doing it, and then to incentivise them, if that's the right word, to sort of turn around. If people who say don't delay it because they're over 30, or freeze your eggs, or whatever you need to deal with that sort of side of it.
There's been all sorts of schemes around the world, government policies to try and incentivise births, and with very limited success. What gives me hope is looking into the eyes of younger people, 12 years old to 24 years old, who watched the documentary, and seeing them shocked that they may have a future without children, should they want them, and many, many do. And I can see, one young woman in Japan watched the documentary and said nothing during a Q&A session, but on the way out whispered to me, "You've changed my life." And that was such a heartening moment. And I assume what she might have meant was that she's going to reprioritise, resequence when she might have a family. So I hope awareness is enough to actually change some minds on this.
Why is it then, this picture that you paint is unremittingly bleak? People like Bill Gates, and I'm just picking him out of a clear blue sky, really, talk about overpopulation. We're still banging on that Paul Ehrlich population bomb thing about, this time next year, they'll be standing room only on the high street. Why are we still being told that there are too many Homo sapiens on Earth?
Well, that's a great question. I think a lot of people have a lot of answers to give on why they're still saying that. Paul Ehrlich is now in his 90s, still saying the same thing as he was saying in the 1960s about overpopulation. And some people will be pleased that we're going to potentially head down through all of these challenging decades to a lower population number. My view is we at least need to be aware of it. We need to know what the challenges are, because there will be big challenges for young and old, and that those people who want to have children should be educated to at least know what the chances are at different times of their life.
But surely there must be a stage, because people are living longer, as we say. There will be a time when the population increases while they live longer, until you reach that ceiling, and then the bits which are feeding into the system are not going through.
Well, that's what's happening right now. The world's population at 8 billion is going to go up to 10 or 11.
Right.
And the only reason is that people are living longer. The total number of births on the planet peaked in 2013, I think it was. We're already down about 5% below that already. So total births are already on the way down. No one knows that, mostly. But we are continuing to grow only for a short time whilst people live out their lives, and that's a good thing.
It seems extraordinary to me that a handful of academics operating in the late 60s and in the 70s might have actually sounded the death knell for the species.
Yeah.
By with their Malthusian attitudes to the species. And doing their mathematical modelling, they've got that wrong, and a handful of academics may have doomed us to extinction.
Yeah, and I think they may have assumed, I know some certainly did, that birth rates will go back up of their own volition. Like, I think in China, the assumption was after they stopped the one-child policy about 8 years ago now, you now can have any number of children in China, that birth rates would go back up. And it's done the opposite in China. So I think there's been a lot of so-called smart people who have got this widely wrong in terms of once you create a societal norm of high levels of childlessness, it's very difficult to reverse.
It's extraordinary. Overpopulation is the drum that powerful, rich people with platforms just keep on banging. And on the contrary, what you are making us aware of is something else entirely. Stephen J. Shaw, thank you so much. I've got no comfort from this whatsoever. I will continue to have sleepless nights. But thank you for doing what you can to bring this to everyone's attention. You have been watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Bev Turner will be with you next week while I am elsewhere, and I'll be back after that.